The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The bustle of the day had subsided, leaving behind an eerie stillness. It was in this twilight hour that Rachel first saw him, a small, trembling figure, barely 8 years old, huddled on the sidewalk. His face was buried in his hands, his body racked with sobs that seemed to shake him to his very core. Rachel, a retired teacher with a heart that had always leaned towards the vulnerable, felt an immediate pull. There was something about the boy's distress that was impossible to ignore. She approached him slowly, careful not to startle him, her voice soft and gentle. "Hello, dear?" she began, kneeling beside him despite the protest of her aging knees. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Where are your parents?" The boy didn't respond immediately. His sobs seemed to intensify at the mention of parents, and Rachel realized with a pang that she had touched upon something deeply painful. She waited, offering silent comfort through her presence, hoping he would feel safe enough to speak. After what felt like an eternity, the boy finally lifted his head. His eyes, red and swollen from crying, met hers. "I don't have any," he whispered, his voice so small that Rachel had to strain to hear. Rachel's heart broke at those words. "No parents," she echoed softly, as if trying to understand the enormity of what he was saying. "Then, who do you live with, dear?" "Nobody," he murmured, looking down at his hands, which were clenched tightly in his lap. "I ran away. From the orphanage." The revelation was like a punch to the gut. Rachel had heard stories, terrible stories about some of the orphanages in the city, places where children were treated more like property than people, forced into labor, and deprived of love and care. The thought of this little boy, so fragile and scared, enduring such a life, was unbearable. "Why did you run away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy hesitated, his eyes filling with fresh tears. They made us work all the time, cleaning, lifting heavy things, even going out to beg for money, and no one cared about us. They just wanted us to make money. I couldn't take it anymore." Rachel felt a surge of anger at the cruelty of it all, but she pushed it down. The boy didn't need her anger, he needed her comfort. "What's your name, dear?" she asked gently. "Peter," he replied, his voice trembling. "Peter," she repeated, smiling softly at him. "That's a beautiful name. My name is Rachel. Would you like to come with me to a quiet place? We can talk more there, and maybe have something warm to drink." Peter looked at her with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a glimmer of trust. Slowly he nodded. Rachel stood up, offering her hand to him, which he took hesitantly at first, but then gripped tightly, as if it were a lifeline. As they walked, Rachel couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for the child beside her. The streetlights cast a soft glow over them, illuminating the path forward. Peter stayed close, his small hand gripping hers, as if afraid that if he let go, he would be swallowed back into the darkness from which he had just escaped. They reached a small, cozy cafe at the corner of the street. The warm light spilling out from the windows was inviting, and Rachel led Peter inside, guiding him to a quiet corner. The cafe was quiet, the soft hum of conversation blending with the clinking of cups and the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. It was a refuge of warmth and light, a stark contrast to the cold world Peter had known. Rachel led him inside, her hand firm but gentle on his shoulder, guiding him to a corner table. She glanced around and spotted Ernesto behind the counter, his familiar, calm presence bringing her a sense of relief. "Ernesto, could we get something warm for the boy?" Rachel called softly as she settled Peter into a chair. Ernesto looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a silent understanding. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Without hesitation he nodded and began preparing a hot chocolate, the rich scent of cocoa filling the air. Laura, a young woman with a bright smile, and an aura of kindness noticed the pair as she passed by on her way to the counter. She was a regular at Ernesto's cafe, often studying in the corner or helping out when it got busy. Today, however, she was drawn to the small figure sitting quietly with Rachel. "Everything okay, Rachel?" Laura asked, her voice filled with concern as she approached the table. Rachel smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is Peter," she introduced, her hand still resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. "He's been through a lot." Laura nodded, her expression softening as she took a seat beside them. "Hi, Peter," she said gently, leaning forward a bit to catch his eye. "It's nice to meet you." Peter looked up at her, his dark eyes still clouded with fear and uncertainty, but there was a flicker of something else, perhaps hope, in his gaze. He managed a small nod, acknowledging her presence but saying nothing. Ernesto arrived at the table, placing the steaming mug of hot chocolate in front of Peter. "Here you go, son," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Take your time." Rachel gave Ernesto a grateful look before turning her attention back to Peter. "You're safe here, Peter," she reassured him. "No one will hurt you." The warmth of the cafe and the comforting presence of the three adults seemed to ease some of the tension in Peter's small frame. He wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the heat that seeped into his cold fingers. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "At the orphanage, they made me work every day," Peter began, his words halting and broken. "They said I had to earn my keep, or I wasn't worth anything." Rachel exchanged a troubled glance with Ernesto and Laura. She reached out and gently touched Peter's arm, encouraging him to continue. "What else, Peter? You can tell us." Peter hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if afraid someone might burst in at any moment. Then, taking a deep breath, he spoke again, his voice trembling. "I heard them talking, the director and a man I didn't know. They said something about a shipment of children. I think they were going to sell us." Laura gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Ernesto's expression darkened, his usually calm demeanor giving way to a storm of emotions. Rachel felt her heart sink. She had feared something like this, but to hear it confirmed by a child's frightened words was almost too much to bear. "They were going to sell us," Peter repeated, his voice cracking as tears welled up in his eyes. "I didn't want to go. I didn't want to be taken away." Rachel leaned in closer, her voice firm yet comforting. "You did the right thing by running away, Peter. We'll make sure you're safe now, and we'll do everything we can to stop them." Peter nodded, though the fear still lingered in his gaze. He sipped his hot chocolate, the warmth slowly melting the ice that had encased his heart for so long. For the first time in a while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for him to escape the nightmares that had haunted him. As the three adults sat in silent determination around him, Peter felt a small flicker of hope ignite within. They would help him. He could see it in their eyes. Officer Ray stood outside the small cafe, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket as he braced himself against the cool evening air. He was a man accustomed to dealing with the darker sides of life, crime, corruption, and the endless grind of trying to maintain order in a world that often seemed bent on chaos. But today, he was facing something different, something that made the usual weight on his shoulders feel even heavier. When he finally stepped inside, the warmth hit him first, followed by the soft murmur of conversation. Ernesto, the cafe's owner, caught his eye and gave him a brief nod before turning his attention back to the espresso machine. Ray appreciated the discretion. The man knew why he was here, and there was no need for unnecessary attention. In the far corner, he saw Rachel sitting with the boy, Peter. The child looked so small, so fragile, sitting there with his hands wrapped around a half-empty mug of hot chocolate. Ray had seen many things in his career, but the sight of a child so clearly haunted by fear always hit him harder than he cared to admit. Rachel looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of worry and hope. "Officer Ray, thank you for coming," she said quietly, gesturing for him to sit down. Ray took a seat across from them, his gaze settling on Peter. "Hello, Peter," he said gently, trying to put the boy at ease. "My name is Ray. I'm a police officer. I'm here to help you. Okay?" Peter glanced up at him, his dark eyes wide with uncertainty. He nodded slightly but said nothing. Ray could see the struggle in those eyes, fear, confusion, and a deep, almost instinctual mistrust. "Peter," Rachel said softly, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, "you can tell Officer Ray what you told us. He's here to make sure those bad people can't hurt you or anyone else again." The boy hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. He looked down at the table, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a room. In the basement, at the orphanage. I never went inside, but I could hear things at night. Strange sounds." Ray leaned forward slightly, his attention focused on every word. "What kind of sounds, Peter?" Peter swallowed, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as if he feared someone might overhear. "Sometimes it sounded like people crying or whispering, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. And then, other times, it was just quiet, but in a way that felt wrong." Ray exchanged a glance with Rachel, both of them realizing the gravity of what the boy was describing. "And you never saw anyone go in or out of that room?" Ray asked carefully. Peter shook his head. "No, but I saw the director go down there once. He was with a man I didn't recognize. They were talking about something. I only heard a little bit, but they said something about a shipment. I think they were talking about the other kids." Ray felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know what that kind of language usually meant, and it wasn't good. "You did the right thing by telling us, Peter," he said, his voice firm but kind. "We're going to look into this. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Peter nodded, though the fear in his eyes hadn't entirely faded. He looked up at Rachel, seeking reassurance, and she gave him a gentle smile. "You're safe now, Peter," she said softly. "No one is going to hurt you again." Ray stood up, ready to leave and start the investigation into the orphanage. But as he looked at the boy one last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger and much darker than they could have anticipated. "Thank you, officer," Rachel said, standing as well. "Please, do everything you can." Ray nodded. "I will," he promised, turning to leave. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he pulled out his phone, already dialing the number for the precinct. There was no time to waste. The investigation had to begin immediately, and they needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. For Peter, and for any other children who might still be trapped in that place. Rachel guided Peter through the narrow streets, the night air crisp as they walked towards her modest home. The boy clung to her hand, his small fingers trembling, though he tried to hide it. He was still processing everything, the warmth of the cafe, the kind voices, and now the promise of a safe place to stay. It was all so foreign to him, yet he desperately wanted to believe it was real. As they reached Rachel's front door, she unlocked it with a steady hand, pushing it open to reveal a cozy, if slightly cluttered, living room. The smell of lavender lingered in the air, a calming scent that immediately enveloped them as they stepped inside. "This will be your home for as long as you need it," Rachel said gently, leading Peter to a small sofa. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll get you something to eat." Peter nodded, sitting down and glancing around the room with wide eyes. The soft lighting and the array of family photos on the walls were a stark contrast to the sterile, cold environment of the orphanage. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he barely recognized: hope. Rachel returned with a plate of warm food and a glass of milk. "Eat up, dear," she encouraged, setting the plate on the coffee table in front of him. "You need to regain your strength." As Peter began to eat slowly, Rachel sat beside him, her thoughts clouded with concern. She knew that the days ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to protect this child from whatever horrors he had escaped. The doorbell rang, breaking her reverie. "I'll get that," she said, patting Peter's arm before rising to answer the door. Standing in the doorway was Officer Ray, his face etched with the seriousness of his task. "Good evening, Rachel," he greeted her with a nod. "May I come in?" "Of course, please," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. Ray walked in, his presence immediately filling the small room. He looked at Peter, who had paused mid-bite, his eyes wide with apprehension. "Don't worry, Peter," Ray said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm just here to talk, that's all." Peter nodded, setting down his fork as Ray took a seat opposite him. Rachel returned to her spot beside the boy, offering silent support. "Peter," Ray began, "I need you to tell me more about the man, the one you saw with the director at the orphanage. Anything you can remember might help us stop them from hurting other children." The boy hesitated, his mind racing back to those dark days at the orphanage, but the safety he felt in Rachel's home gave him the courage to speak. "He had a long scar on his face," Peter whispered, his voice trembling. "It went from his eye down to his chin. He was tall, and he always wore a black coat." Ray listened intently, noting every detail. "Did you ever hear his name?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. Peter shook his head. "No, but the director called him the buyer. He came to the orphanage a lot. Whenever he was there, the director made us stay in our rooms. We weren't allowed to see him." Ray exchanged a grim look with Rachel. This information confirmed their worst fears, that the man with the scar was deeply involved in something far more sinister than they had anticipated. "Thank you, Peter," Ray said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "You're very brave for telling us this. We're going to find him and make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Peter nodded, though the fear in his eyes hadn't entirely disappeared. He glanced at Rachel, who gave him a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing, Peter," she whispered. "You're safe now." As Ray stood to leave, he paused by the door. "We'll need to continue investigating this," he said to Rachel. "I'll be in touch. But for now, just keep him safe." Rachel nodded. "I will," she promised, watching as he stepped out into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the house in a comforting silence. Peter let out a small breath, the tension slowly leaving his body. As Rachel sat back down beside him, she knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it. Together, they would navigate the darkness of Peter's past, one step at a time, until the light of truth finally broke through. The afternoon light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the small room where Peter sat, his legs curled beneath him on the worn couch. Rachel had stepped out briefly, leaving him with a book to occupy his mind, but his thoughts were far too restless to focus on the words. His life had changed so abruptly, from the cold confines of the orphanage to the uncertain warmth of Rachel's care. Yet a deep unease still lingered, the kind that no amount of comfort could completely erase. A knock at the door pulled him from his reverie, and his heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the anxiety that had become almost second nature to him flared up instantly. He heard Rachel's footsteps in the hallway, her soft voice as she greeted the visitor. But the voice that responded, a male voice, low and tinged with something that Peter couldn't quite place, made him freeze. "Peter, there's someone here to see you," Rachel called gently from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "He says he's your father." Peter's stomach dropped. His father? It couldn't be. He had no father, no one who cared enough to claim him, to come for him. Yet there was a part of him, deep down, that clung to the hope he had buried long ago. Slowly he slid off the couch, his small frame tensing with every step as he walked toward the doorway. When he saw the man standing there, his breath caught in his throat. The man was tall, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with years of worry and regret. But it was his eyes that struck Peter the most. They were filled with an intensity, a depth of emotion that Peter had rarely seen directed at him. "Peter," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm Javier, your father." Peter stared at him, his mind reeling. This man, his father. It didn't make sense. If he was really his father, why hadn't he come for him before? Why had he left him in that terrible place? Javier seemed to sense Peter's confusion, his hesitation. He stepped closer, though he was careful not to move too quickly, not to overwhelm the boy. "I know this must be very confusing for you," Javier began, his voice gentle but earnest. "But I've been looking for you, Peter, for years. Every day I've been searching." Peter's brow furrowed, a spark of anger mingling with his confusion. "If you were looking for me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "why didn't you find me? Why didn't you stop them from taking me?" Javier flinched as if struck. He had expected this, had known that he would have to face the consequences of his absence, but it didn't make the reality any less painful. "I didn't find you because I made a terrible mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "After your mother died, I wasn't myself. I was lost, distracted. And one day I took you to the park. I only turned away for a moment, but when I looked back, you were gone." The memory was as fresh and raw in Javier's mind as if it had happened yesterday. The panic, the desperate search through the crowded park, calling Peter's name until his voice was hoarse. The realization that his son had vanished, and with him any hope of holding on to the last piece of the life he had shared with his wife. "I searched for you, Peter," Javier continued, his voice breaking. "Everywhere. I never stopped. But they must have taken you quickly, hidden you away. And I was too late." Peter's anger began to wane, replaced by a deep sadness that mirrored the pain in Javier's eyes. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" he asked, his voice small, the question filled with the ache of years lost. "I tried," Javier whispered, stepping closer, his eyes pleading, "but it was like you vanished into thin air. I didn't know where to look. But then I saw a news story about a boy who had escaped from an orphanage. Something about it, about you, felt familiar. I knew it had to be you." He paused, searching Peter's face for any sign of recognition, of acceptance. "I've made so many mistakes," Javier admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But I'm here now. I'm not leaving you again, Peter. I promise you that." Peter stared at him, his heart torn between the desire to believe and the fear of being hurt again. This man, his father, seemed sincere, but how could he trust him after all this time, after everything he had been through? Rachel, who had been watching quietly, stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Peter's shoulder. "You don't have to decide anything right now, Peter," she said softly. "Take your time, but know that you're not alone anymore." Peter nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on Javier. The man's eyes were filled with tears now, the weight of his regret and love laid bare. It was too much to process all at once, too overwhelming. But there was something in Javier's voice, in his eyes, that Peter couldn't ignore. A truth, perhaps, that had been missing for so long. I don't know," Peter whispered, his voice shaky. "I don't know if I can trust you." Javier's face softened with a sad smile. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I'm going to earn your trust, Peter, no matter how long it takes." And with that, a fragile connection was formed between them, a tentative step toward a future that neither of them could fully comprehend, but both were willing to try. The office of Detective Lewis was a far cry from the glamour often associated with police work. It was a small, cluttered room tucked away in the corner of the precinct, its walls lined with case files and photographs pinned to corkboards. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and the weight of unsolved mysteries. Yet, for Detective Elena Louis, this was the nerve center of her world, a place where puzzles were pieced together and justice was pursued with unwavering determination. Louis sat behind her desk, her sharp eyes scanning the latest reports that had come in from the field. The investigation into the orphanage had taken a dark and unexpected turn. What had started as a simple inquiry into a corrupt institution had ballooned into something far more sinister. The evidence now pointed to an extensive human trafficking network, with connections reaching far beyond the city's limits. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly under her weight, and rubbed her temples. The scale of the operation was staggering. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of children sold like commodities, their lives exchanged for money in shadowy deals conducted across borders. The orphanage was just the tip of the iceberg. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, straightening in her chair. Officer Ray stepped in, his expression as serious as ever. Behind him, Peter hesitated in the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing figure of the officer. Louis motioned for them to sit, her eyes softening as they met Peter's. "Peter," she said gently, "thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy, but you're helping us a lot by being here." Peter nodded, his face pale but resolute. Over the past few weeks, he had shown remarkable bravery, opening up about the horrors he had witnessed at the orphanage. His testimony had been invaluable, providing crucial leads that had steered the investigation in the right direction. But Louis knew there was more, much more, that he had yet to share. "Peter," she began, keeping her tone calm and reassuring, "we've learned a lot from what you've already told us, but we need to know if there's anything else you remember. Anything that might help us stop these people." The boy looked down at his hands, which were tightly clasped in his lap. For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension almost palpable. Then, finally, Peter spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There were times," he began, "when they took some of the older kids away. They said it was for a better life. But I knew they were lying. The kids never came back." Louise leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she listened intently. "Do you know where they took them?" she asked. Peter shook his head. "No, but I heard them talking once. The man with the scar. He was telling the director that they needed more children, that there were buyers waiting. He said they were going to send them overseas, to places where no one would ever find them. A chill ran down Louis's spine. This was what she had feared, an international trafficking ring with roots deep enough to evade even the most diligent law enforcement efforts. She exchanged a glance with Ray, who looked equally disturbed. "Peter," Louis said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "what you've told us is very important. It means we're dealing with something much bigger than just the orphanage. But because of you, we have a chance to stop them." Peter looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did," he said, his voice stronger now. "I want to help." Louis smiled, a small but genuine expression of gratitude and admiration. "You're already helping more than you know," she said. "But there's one more thing. We need to identify the man with the scar. Do you think you could describe him in more detail? Anything you can remember might help us track him down." Peter nodded slowly, his mind working to dredge up memories he had tried so hard to forget. He was tall, taller than most of the other men. His hair was dark and his scar, it went from here to here. He traced a line from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw, just as he had before. He always wore dark clothes and he smelled like smoke. Like cigarettes, but stronger. And he had a deep voice. I remember it because it scared me. The way he talked, like he didn't care about anything. Louis scribbled down notes, her mind already piecing together the description with what little they had on file. This was a breakthrough, a chance to put a face to the shadowy figure who had been orchestrating these heinous acts. "Thank you, Peter," she said, closing her notebook and leaning back in her chair. "You've done more than enough for today. We'll take it from here." Peter nodded, a small sigh of relief escaping his lips. He glanced at Ray, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then back at Louis. "Will you stop them?" Peter asked, his voice tinged with the innocence of a child, but also the weary knowledge of one who had seen too much. "We will," Louis replied firmly. "I promise you, Peter, we'll do everything in our power to stop them." As Peter left the office with Ray, Louis sat back, her mind racing with the possibilities. The web of crime they had uncovered was vast, but with each new piece of information, they were one step closer to bringing it down, and she would not rest until every last one of them was behind bars. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Rachel's small living room, casting a warm, golden light on the worn wooden floor. Peter sat silently by the window, his gaze fixed on the street below, where children played, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. But the sound didn't reach him. His mind was far away, tangled in a web of confusion and uncertainty. Rachel watched him from the kitchen, her heart heavy with concern. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind for the boy. First, the trauma of the orphanage, then the unexpected appearance of his father, Javier. It was no wonder that Peter was struggling to make sense of his emotions. She wiped her hands on a towel and made her way over to him, her steps slow and deliberate. "Peter," she called softly, drawing his attention. "Why don't you come sit with me? We can talk if you'd like." Peter turned to look at her, his dark eyes clouded with thoughts too heavy for someone his age. He nodded slowly and moved to the couch, sitting down with his hands folded in his lap. Rachel joined him, sitting close enough to offer comfort, but giving him space to speak when he was ready. "Rachel," Peter began after a long silence, his voice small and uncertain. "What should I do? I don't know how to feel about him." Rachel understood immediately. "You mean your father?" Peter nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "He says he's sorry, that he wants to be with me again, but it's hard. I don't know if I can trust him. What if he leaves me again?" Rachel took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. It's okay to feel unsure, Peter. What you've been through, it's more than any child should ever have to face. Trust is something that has to be earned, and it's okay if you're not ready to give it yet. Peter looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of fear and hope. But he's my father, he whispered. Shouldn't I want to be with him? Rachel felt a pang in her chest. Families are complicated, she said gently. Sometimes it takes time to figure out what's best. What's most important is that you feel safe and loved wherever you are. Peter seemed to mull this over, his brow furrowing as he tried to sort through his emotions. I feel safe with you, he admitted quietly. You've been so kind to me, and I don't want to leave. But if he's really changed, shouldn't I give him a chance? Rachel reached out and took his hand in hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Peter, you don't have to make any decisions right now. It's okay to take your time, to let your feelings guide you. If you decide to give him a chance, that's okay. And if you decide you need more time, that's okay too. No one is going to rush you. As they sat together in the quiet room, the doorbell rang, breaking the stillness. Peter's body tensed and Rachel could see the anxiety flash across his face. She patted his hand gently before rising to answer the door. Standing on the threshold was Javier, his expression a mixture of nervousness and hope. He had been visiting regularly, trying to rebuild the bond with his son, but the process was slow and fraught with uncertainty. "Hello, Rachel," he greeted, his voice tinged with the ever-present guilt he carried. "Is Peter here?" Rachel nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "He's in the living room." Javier entered, his eyes immediately finding Peter, who was watching him with the same cautious gaze as before. He approached slowly, as if afraid to startle him. "Peter," he said softly, kneeling in front of the couch to be at eye level with his son. "How are you today?" Peter shrugged, his expression guarded. "Okay," he replied, his tone neutral. Javier hesitated, then spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. "I know this is hard, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We can take this as slow as you need." Peter studied him for a long moment, the battle between his heart and mind playing out in the silence. Finally he nodded, a small but significant gesture of willingness to try, if only a little. Rachel watched them, her heart aching with the weight of the decision she knew she would have to make soon. Peter was finding comfort with her, but she also saw the glimmer of hope in Javier's eyes, the hope that he could rebuild what he had lost. She knew that whatever choice was made, it had to be what was best for Peter, even if it meant letting go. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Rachel knew that the days ahead would not be easy. But for now, she would focus on the present, on the small steps Peter was taking toward healing. The future, with all its uncertainties, could wait. The air in Rachel's home had grown heavier over the past few days, a tension lingering just below the surface. Peter, though more at ease with Rachel and slowly warming to his father, had begun to feel the creeping presence of fear once again. The quiet moments of laughter and calm were often interrupted by a flash of something darker, an awareness that, beyond the safety of the house, shadows were gathering. It was late afternoon when the knock came. Rachel and Javier exchanged a glance, both of them feeling the unease ripple through the room. Peter was seated at the kitchen table, a book open in front of him, but his eyes were not on the pages. Javier stood, wiping his palms on his jeans as he walked to the door. When he opened it, 2 police officers stood on the other side. One of them was Officer Ray, his face grim but composed. "We need to talk," Ray said, stepping inside and gesturing for the other officer to follow. Rachel moved to stand next to Javier, her brows furrowed with concern. Peter, sensing the shift in the air, closed his book and watched them, his body tense. "There's been a development," Ray began, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "The investigation into the orphanage has uncovered more details. It's worse than we thought. The trafficking network extends much farther, and Peter's testimony, it's crucial." Javier's hands clenched into fists, his expression hardening. "What does that mean for us?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. Ray glanced at Peter, his gaze softening before turning back to Javier and Rachel. "It means they know," he said quietly. "The people involved, they know Peter is a witness, and they know how much he's seen." Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Javier took a step toward Ray, his eyes blazing with fear and anger. "Are you saying he's in danger?" Ray nodded solemnly. "Yes. We believe they may try to get to him before we can fully expose their operations. We've already put out warnings, but we can't be sure who's working for them. It's a large network, and they have resources. We need to move Peter to a secure location." Peter watched the exchange with growing dread. The idea that he had become a target because of what he knew felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The safety he had begun to feel with Rachel and Javier was slipping away, replaced by the cold reality of the danger that lurked outside. "But where can we go?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How can we protect him?" Ray placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We have a safe house prepared. It's out of the city, isolated. No one will know you're there except for the officers assigned to the case. You'll be protected until we can bring down the entire network." Javier stepped closer to Peter, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll go with you," he said firmly. "Both of us. We're not leaving you alone in this." Peter looked up at his father, seeing the determination in his eyes. For the first time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Javier had made his choice, and he was staying. Rachel nodded in agreement, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "We'll stay together," she said, "no matter what happens." Ray gave them a small nod of approval. "Pack what you need," he said. "We'll leave within the hour. I'll make sure we have a secure transport arranged." As the officers stepped outside to prepare, Rachel and Javier hurried to gather their things. Peter stood in the middle of the living room, his mind racing. It felt strange, packing up his life again, just as he had when he ran from the orphanage. But this time he wasn't alone. This time he had people who cared about him, people who would protect him. But as they packed, Peter couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a familiar sensation, one that had haunted him at the orphanage. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing there. Still, the unease remained, a persistent reminder of the danger they were fleeing from. By the time the police transport arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of deep blue and grey. Ray led them to the vehicle, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. The other officer opened the door, ushering them inside. As they drove away, Peter sat between Rachel and Javier, his hands clenched in his lap. He glanced at the two of them, seeing the worry etched on their faces. But even in the midst of the fear, there was a strength, an unspoken promise that they would face whatever came next together. The road stretched out before them, long and winding, disappearing into the darkness. Peter stared out the window, watching as the city lights faded into the distance. The safe house was nestled deep within the forest, its secluded location chosen to ensure that no one could find them without considerable effort. Inside, The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Peter sat in a small room on the second floor, his gaze fixed on the trees outside, their dark silhouettes swaying gently in the night breeze. He knew the operation was about to begin, and though he was far from the action, the weight of his role pressed heavily on his young shoulders. Downstairs, Rachel and Javier paced the living room, exchanging worried glances but saying little. They both understood the gravity of the situation. They were safe for now. But out there, in the heart of the city, a battle was about to unfold. Back in the city, the special task force assembled in a dimly lit warehouse that served as their command center. Detective Louis stood at the center of the room, her eyes scanning the faces of her team. These were seasoned officers, men and women who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, yet their resolve remained unshaken. This mission was unlike any other they had undertaken. This was about saving children, about stopping a network that had thrived on the exploitation of the innocent for far too long. "Tonight, we end this," Louis began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the low hum of tension that filled the room. "We've gathered enough evidence, thanks to Peter's bravery, to bring these monsters down. But they're not going to go quietly. We have to be ready for anything." The team members nodded, their expressions grim and determined. They knew the risks. They knew that the criminals they were about to confront were not just opportunists, but organized and dangerous. Yet the thought of what was at stake, the lives of children, the end of a horrific trade, pushed any fear aside. Louis turned to the map pinned on the wall, detailing the layout of the orphanage and the surrounding buildings. "We'll move in from 3 sides," she continued, tracing the plan with her finger. "Team Alpha will secure the main entrance, Team Bravo will cover the back, and Team Charlie will enter through the basement where the traffickers have been operating. Remember, our primary objective is to secure the children and take down the leaders of this operation. No one gets away." As the teams prepared to move out, the tension in the room sharpened, every second stretching out as they neared the moment of action. Louis gave one final nod, her silent signal for them to proceed. The teams moved with purpose, their gear clinking softly in the otherwise quiet space, every footstep a step closer to justice. At the orphanage, the atmosphere was unnervingly quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Inside, the traffickers were oblivious to the storm about to descend upon them, still confident in their power and secrecy. The first breach was swift. Team Alpha moved in through the front, their weapons at the ready, the element of surprise working in their favor. Shouts filled the air as the traffickers, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, their movements frantic and disorganized. The officers moved with precision, quickly securing the main hallways and locking down exits. Team Bravo entered through the rear, cutting off any chance of escape. The traffickers who attempted to flee were met with the unyielding force of the law, their attempts to resist swiftly neutralized. But it was Team Charlie entering through the basement that faced the greatest challenge. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and hidden rooms, the heart of the trafficking operation. Here, the most dangerous individuals were stationed, those who had orchestrated the suffering of countless children. The officers advanced cautiously, their steps silent on the cold concrete floor. They knew what awaited them: desperation, violence, the last-ditch efforts of criminals with nothing left to lose. When they finally encountered the traffickers, the confrontation was brutal and chaotic. Shots rang out, echoing through the confined space, punctuated by the sharp orders of the officers and the panicked shouts of the criminals. Louis led the charge, her resolve like steel as she pushed forward, every movement calculated and decisive. Her team fought with the knowledge that failure was not an option, that the lives of those who could not defend themselves depended on their success. In the chaos, one of the traffickers, a man with a deep scar running down his cheek, the very same that Peter had described, attempted to slip away. But Louis was quicker. She cornered him in a narrow passage, her weapon trained on him with unwavering focus. "It's over," she said, her voice cold and final. "You're not getting away this time." The man sneered, but there was fear in his eyes. He knew he was caught. With a final, desperate move, he lunged at her, but Louis was ready. She disarmed him with a swift motion, bringing him to the ground and securing the handcuffs with a snap that echoed in the silence that followed. As the dust settled, the traffickers subdued and the children secured. The team regrouped. The operation was a success. They had dismantled the network and the leaders were in custody, their reign of terror finally over. Back at the safe house, the news reached Peter, Rachel, and Javier. Relief washed over them, though the reality of what had happened, what they had all endured, would take time to fully process. But for now, they could breathe a little easier, knowing that the shadows that had once threatened to consume them had been pushed back, if only for a while. The early morning light streamed through the windows of Rachel's cozy kitchen, casting a warm glow over the simple wooden table where Peter sat, a gentle smile on his face. Across from him, Javier and Rachel shared a look of quiet contentment, their hearts full as they watched the boy who had come to mean so much to them. The events of the past weeks had been a whirlwind, dark and terrifying at times, but with a conclusion that brought a profound sense of relief. The network that had stolen so many lives, that had threatened to take Peter's innocence and safety, was no more. The criminals were behind bars, and justice had finally been served. But it wasn't just justice that had been delivered. It was hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, Peter felt safe. Truly safe. He had found something that had once seemed impossible. A family. Not just people who took care of him out of duty, but two people who genuinely loved him, who wanted to build a life with him. "More toast?" Rachel asked, her voice light and cheerful as she reached for the bread. Peter nodded, his eyes bright as he met hers. "Yes, please," he replied, a hint of shyness still in his tone, though it was slowly being replaced by confidence that he belonged here. Javier, sitting beside Peter, ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "I think we've got a lot to look forward to, don't we, Peter?" Peter looked up at his father, the man who had returned to him with a heart full of regret and determination to make things right. There had been a time when Peter didn't know if he could trust Javier again, but now, with each passing day, that trust was growing, rooted in the small, everyday moments like this one. "Yes," Peter said softly, his voice carrying a weight of certainty that belied his years. "I think so too." Rachel placed the toast in front of Peter, her heart swelling with pride and love as she watched him. She had always wanted a family, and though life had taken her down a different path, she couldn't help but feel that this unexpected twist of fate was exactly where she was meant to be. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle clinking of silverware on plates. Outside, the world was waking up, but inside this small kitchen, a new world was being built, one filled with love, safety, and hope. As they finished breakfast, Javier looked at Peter with a smile. "What do you say we go for a walk later? There's a park nearby, and I think you'll like it." Peter nodded eagerly, the idea of exploring this new life with the people he cared about filling him with warmth. "I'd like that," Rachel smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. This was their new beginning, a chance to create something beautiful, out of the darkness they had all faced. And as they prepared to step into the day, Peter knew that this was the start of something good, something real. He had found his place, his family, and with them he was ready to face whatever the future might hold. Together, they were stronger. Together, they had found hope. And that's the incredible journey of Matteo, a story of courage, hope, and the power of resilience. We hope this tale has touched your heart as deeply as it has touched ours. Stories like these remind us of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. If you found value in today's story, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and inspiring content. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What did this story mean to you? Drop a comment below and let's start a conversation. Thank you for being a part of our community, where we believe in the power of storytelling to make the world a better place. Until next time, stay safe, stay inspired, and keep sharing stories that matter. See you in the next video.